The night air over Babylon hung thick as oil, heavy with incense, sweat, and the faint sweetness of burning myrrh. The great ziggurat loomed above the city like a stairway to judgment, its golden tip reflecting the firelight of 1,000 torches below. From the courtyards of the temples came the sound of drums, slow, methodical, like the heartbeat of a god waiting to decide who was pure and who would bleed. Beneath that glow, men and women knelt in the dust, their eyes fixed on the marble steps where the priest stood. They whispered confessions that would never bring forgiveness, only sentence. For in Babylon there was no word for mercy that did not first pass through pain. Imagine standing there, in a world where the gods were not silent but cruelly attentive, where a single accusation could tear flesh from dignity. The scent of the river mixed with the iron tang of blood, and from the distant gates the sound of chains echoed against the stone. Those who had transgressed the sacred laws of the body, women accused of adultery, slaves caught in forbidden desire, priests who had defiled a vow, were brought forward barefoot, their wrists bound with hemp, their eyes blindfolded to keep them from seeing the faces that condemned them. Their crime was desire, their punishment a spectacle. Babylon did not hide its justice behind closed doors. It displayed it like a sermon carved in flesh. In the eyes of its rulers, every act of lust, every betrayal of chastity was not simply personal. It was treason against divine order. The human body belonged to the gods, and to misuse it was to challenge heaven itself. So the city made punishment holy, pain became ritual, and law became theater. When the priests spoke, their voices echoed through the courtyard like hammers striking bronze tablets, words that turned sin into ceremony, that promised redemption only through humiliation. This was the heart of ancient civilization, the first to codify justice, the first to write law into stone. And yet, buried beneath those same stones, lay horrors that few dare to remember. Before we descend into this labyrinth of judgment and desire, take a breath and steel yourself. Because what you are about to hear is not merely history, it is a mirror of how far humanity will go to make sin divine. Before we dive deeper into this shadow of history, hit subscribe, because what follows are truths too disturbing for the light. Now, let's step into Babylon, to understand the punishments that awaited the flesh in ancient Babylon. One must first understand the world that birthed them. A civilization of dazzling grandeur and silent terror, where law and religion were woven together so tightly that to sin against one was to offend both. Babylon was not merely a city, it was a statement carved into the earth, a vision of divine order manifest through human hands. Rising from the Mesopotamian plains, its walls stretched for miles, glimmering in the desert sun, while canals carved by slaves carried life through its veins. The Euphrates did not simply nourish it, it sanctified it, for in those waters every oath, every curse, and every execution found reflection. The people of Babylon believed themselves chosen by the gods to preserve balance in a world teetering between chaos and creation. And to preserve that balance, they wrote laws not in ink, but in stone. Around 1750 BCE, under the reign of King Hammurabi, those laws were etched into basalt tablets that stood upright in the center of the city, visible to all. The Code of Hammurabi, one of humanity's oldest legal monuments, was both a moral compass and a threat. Its language was absolute, its punishments unflinching. Carved in cuneiform script, these laws claimed divine origin. Hammurabi himself was depicted receiving them from Shamash, the god of justice, whose rays of fire extended down toward the mortal king. It was a declaration that law itself was sacred, unchangeable, unquestionable, and merciless. The people did not obey out of fear of rulers, but out of fear of gods, who saw into every chamber, every bed, every heart. It was this fusion of the divine and the bureaucratic that gave Babylonian law its terrifying precision. Sexual morality, in Babylon, was not a matter of private conscience, but of cosmic consequence. Desire was believed to carry spiritual energy, a force capable of both blessing and destruction. Fertility rituals were woven into the rhythms of the city. Priestesses known as Nadu were consecrated to serve the gods through sacred sexuality, a practice later twisted into accusation and punishment when the moral winds shifted. To transgress sexually was to unbalance the cosmos, to anger the gods who governed prosperity, harvest, and fate. And so, the state began to regulate desire as if it were a resource to be mined, traded, and punished. The body, especially the female body, became a ledger upon which the city's morality was written. Within Babylon's layered society, this regulation of flesh reflected hierarchy. The freeborn woman, the concubine, the slave, the priestess, all lived under different interpretations of the same law. A nobleman's wife could be drowned for adultery, while his slave might merely be branded. The very same act could be divine ritual when performed in the temple, and mortal crime when done in private. It was a civilization that rationalized contradiction, dressing cruelty in the robes of holiness. The higher the rank, the harsher the judgment, for the purity of the elite was thought to safeguard the purity of the realm. Every punishment served a purpose beyond vengeance. It was pedagogy, a lesson in obedience, a visual sermon for the masses. But behind the grandeur of the laws lay the darker truth of power. Babylon's justice was not blind. It was deliberate. The laws of Hammurabi were not designed for equality, but for order, for hierarchy maintained through terror. They elevated men as divine stewards while reducing women to vessels of purity or shame. Every clause that mentioned adultery, every decree concerning fidelity, revealed more about fear than morality. The fear of lineage corrupted, of inheritance stolen, of divine wrath unleashed through female autonomy. The punishments were not born from prudishness, but from paranoia, a need to control life at its most primal source. In the temple courtyards, the line between judgment and ritual blurred. Priests presided over punishments in the same spaces where sacrifices were offered and hymns were sung. To punish was to purify, to humiliate was to restore cosmic order. A woman accused of adultery might be led before a statue of Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, her garments torn, her hair unbound as the crowd watched in reverent silence. The executioner did not act as a mere enforcer, but as a priest performing sacred duty, his whip not a weapon but an instrument of divine correction. Even when the condemned screamed, it was said that the gods were merely listening to their confession. And yet, amid the cruelty, Babylon saw itself as righteous. Its laws were not framed as oppression, but as justice, justice that came from the heavens themselves. Each punishment, no matter how severe, was inscribed with the illusion of fairness, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a body for a body. But the symmetry was false. The hands that held the chisel of law were not those who would ever feel its edge. The Code of Hammurabi promised equality before the gods, but in practice it reinforced inequality among men. Babylon's moral order was not merely written, it was staged. The temple, the marketplace, and the court were one continuous theater of virtue and violence. The people watched the condemned as one might watch a ritual sacrifice, both horrified and reassured. To witness punishment was to be cleansed of one's own hidden sins. This psychological manipulation kept the empire obedient. The spectacle of pain was both warning and entertainment, a divine performance ensuring that the fear of shame would run deeper than the fear of death. Thus, when we speak of sexual punishments in Babylonian law, we do not speak of private cruelty, but of public policy. These were not acts of vengeance, they were sermons preached through suffering, spectacles designed to teach morality through terror. The stones of Babylon's streets, worn smooth by centuries of processions, still carry the echoes of those who were made examples in the name of purity. What began as law soon became theater, and what was called justice became ritualized degradation. The empire that claimed to civilize the world built its moral foundations upon the suffering of its own people. Every law tablet, every judgment rendered beneath the watchful eyes of Shamash carried the same hidden message, that fear is the surest guardian of faith. Babylon's brilliance rose on the backs of the broken. And as we step deeper into its shadows, the distinction between divine order and human cruelty begins to blur completely, because what awaited those who defied its sacred laws of flesh was not merely punishment. It was annihilation disguised as justice. In Babylon, justice began not with evidence, but with ordeal. The accused did not stand before human judges. They stood before the gods themselves, who were believed to speak through water, fire, and pain. When a woman was accused of adultery, or a man of violating sacred purity, the trial was not an argument. It was an ordeal of flesh. The priests would lead the accused to the banks of the Euphrates, where crowds gathered to watch the will of heaven unfold. The air shimmered with heat and the smell of mud. The river's slow current glistened like molten bronze under the sun. Before the eyes of the multitude, the accused was stripped of ornaments, her hair loosened, a symbolic unbinding of her honor, and then she was forced into the river. This was the ordeal by water, one of the oldest forms of divine judgment in human history. If she sank and drowned, it was said the river had claimed her guilt. If she floated, the gods had spared her innocence. It was a cruel paradox. Innocence was often proven only through death. Yet to the Babylonians, this was not barbarity. It was balance, divine equilibrium restored through sacrifice. The crowd would bow as her body disappeared beneath the current, believing that justice had been served. The river did not need to speak, it merely needed to take. This ordeal extended beyond women. Slaves accused of sexual defiance or temple desecration were subjected to the same ritual. The spectacle reinforced hierarchy. Those at the top watched, those below suffered. The priests framed it as moral purification, a sacred cleansing of sin through the mercy of the gods. But beneath that sacred language lay a far simpler truth. The state required witnesses, and suffering was its most convincing evidence. To see someone endure agony was to reaffirm the order of the world. The Euphrates, with its calm and unhurried flow, became Babylon's silent executioner, swallowing guilt and innocence alike beneath its surface. What the river spared, society destroyed. Those who survived were marked forever, not as vindicated souls, but as cursed ones, people who had touched the threshold between life and divine judgment. For them, survival itself became a kind of exile. In the heart of Babylonian law lay an unspoken axiom: a woman did not belong to herself. Her body was her husband's covenant, her father's reputation, her king's concern. The Code of Hammurabi did not define women as citizens, but as extensions of men's honor and property. Adultery, therefore, was not a crime of passion. It was theft, the unlawful use of what belonged to another man. A woman accused of infidelity was not judged for desire, but for desecration. The punishment was as symbolic as it was physical. Many were dragged into the public square, stripped to the waist, and bound in front of their husband's household. Her body was presented not as a person, but as evidence. The sentence was drowning, a method both cleansing and final. The condemned was led to the river in a procession that resembled both funeral and ritual. Her cries were drowned by drums, her pleas silenced by the hymns of priests who recited verses about purity and shame. When she was thrown into the water, the crowd watched, not in outrage, but in solemn acceptance, because in Babylon, purity was more sacred than mercy. The cruelty of this order did not stop at the wife. The law extended into the labyrinth of household hierarchies: concubines, slaves, handmaidens. A concubine who defied her master's authority might be branded across the forehead or mutilated in a way that erased her desirability forever. A slave who resisted sexual command could be put to death for insolence. One who submitted too eagerly might be punished for seduction. The law left no room for innocence. Every outcome favored the dominion of the powerful. Even the act of accusation was a weapon. If a husband merely suspected infidelity, he could drag his wife before the judges and demand the ordeal. The law did not require proof, only fear. Thus, the institution of marriage became a quiet cage, gilded with ritual but secured by terror. The home mirrored the state, obedience preserved order, and disobedience, especially of the flesh, was met with annihilation. In Babylon, sex was not always condemned. In fact, in its earliest rituals, it was divine. The temples of Ishtar, goddess of love and war, once celebrated sacred prostitution as an act of spiritual communion. Priestesses called Ishtaritu or Nadtu offered their bodies in service to the goddess, bridging the mortal and divine through the ritual of union. But as centuries passed and the empire grew rigid under law, what was once sacred became suspect. The same priestesses who had been vessels of divine pleasure were redefined as corrupters of purity. Those accused of defiling the temple's sanctity faced punishments designed to erase their identity and sanctity alike. Some were whipped publicly within temple courtyards, their blood spattering against the marble steps of the altars they once served. Others were branded across the abdomen, the the same place life would have grown, marking them as cursed, untouchable. These punishments revealed Babylon's deepest hypocrisy. The empire glorified fertility, adored goddesses, and built temples to love, yet sought to control and mutilate the very vessels of that love. The priests who condemned these women often partook of the same rituals in secret, cloaking lust in piety. In public, the language of sin justified their cruelty. In private, that cruelty fed desire. The pain of the punished became the pleasure of the watchers. The crowd saw not a woman being purged, but a civilization cleansing itself of the sins it secretly indulged. The chants of the priests blended with the woman's cries, merging into a single sound that Babylon called justice. It was through such contradictions that the city preserved its illusion of holiness, and in that illusion lay its greatest sin. Though women bore the brunt of Babylon's sexual laws, men were not immune. When a man's offense was judged to have violated sacred or social boundaries, rape, incest, the defilement of a priestess, or adultery with another man's wife, the punishment was designed to mirror the nature of his sin. The most common was castration, carried out with ritualistic precision. Babylon believed that the organ of sin must die with the sin itself. The condemned man was stripped naked before the temple gate, surrounded by witnesses who included priests, scribes, and sometimes even the victim's family. A blade of bronze, sanctified by the priest's blessing, gleamed in the sunlight. The air would tremble with chanting invocations to Shamash, the god of justice, and Ereshkigal, goddess of the underworld, to accept the flesh that had defied divine law. Then came the act itself, swift, deliberate, and absolute. The screams were drowned by the sound of drums and horns, a deliberate cacophony to remind the crowd that justice was louder than pain. Yet even this was not the worst fate. In some cases, particularly those involving temple violation or sexual defiance against royalty, the punishment escalated into mutilation or impalement. Historical accounts describe offenders who were impaled through the lower abdomen, left to hang for hours while priests recited the transgressors' crimes as warnings to onlookers. Others were burned alive with pitch, their bodies becoming blackened offerings to the gods. These punishments were not simply retribution, they were deterrence through horror. Babylon understood that terror was the most effective teacher. Each execution was a message carved into public memory, ensuring that even those who had never sinned would live in constant dread of doing so. The irony lay in the unevenness of this justice. Men of noble birth could often buy their way out of mutilation through offerings or gold, while slaves or commoners suffered the full weight of the law. The same act, judged by the same code, yielded vastly different fates depending on one's bloodline. And yet, the spectacle of punishment preserved the illusion of equality. The public saw the act, the blade, the screams, the ritual, and believed that divine justice had been served. The empire relied on that illusion to maintain control, for the sight of a man destroyed for his lust was enough to make 1,000 others discipline their desires into silence. By the height of Babylon's empire, punishment had evolved into performance. Justice was no longer an event, it was theater. Public squares, once places of commerce, became stages for humiliation. The condemned were paraded through streets lined with merchants, soldiers, and children, their crimes proclaimed by heralds with booming voices. Adulterers were forced to walk naked, garlanded with thorns or ashes, their heads bowed while crowds hurled stones, curses, and filth. The goal was not only to destroy the body, but to erase the soul, to make punishment a spectacle of erasure so profound that memory itself became an instrument of control. The sight of suffering was transformed into civic ritual, a reaffirmation of divine order through collective cruelty. Babylon's punishments were not hidden in dungeons or whispered about in shame, they were celebrated in sunlight. The empire believed that morality could not exist in private. It had to be seen, displayed, and enforced through public terror. The priests called it purification, the rulers called it deterrence, the people, perhaps, called it justice. But beneath that choreography of righteousness lay voyeurism, the dark thrill of watching others bear the sins we secretly shared. Every execution was both sermon and entertainment. The crowd cheered not for the gods, but for the relief that their own transgressions had escaped notice. Shame, in Babylon, was currency. Those who survived public disgrace carried it like a scar that never healed. Some punishments were even more symbolic. A woman accused of enticing a man outside her station might have her mouth seared with hot metal, so that the organ of temptation could never again defile speech. Men accused of violating sacred boundaries might be forced to kneel before the temple and lick the dust at the priest's feet, a ritual meant to return them to the earth, to remind them that in sin they had become less than human. Even death could be denied to those whom the state wished to humiliate eternally. They were left alive, mutilated and broken, as living warnings to others. In Babylon, survival was not mercy. It was prolonged judgment. What made these spectacles so terrifying was not their brutality, but their sanctity. The people believed in them. They believed that each lash, each mutilation, each drowning was necessary to preserve the fragile order between gods and mortals. The priests taught that to question punishment was to question the gods themselves. Thus, the machinery of cruelty perpetuated itself, not through force, but through faith. Babylon became a city where law and ritual were indistinguishable, where morality demanded blood, and where every act of punishment was both devotion and desecration. And yet, the deeper we descend into this system of fear, the clearer its purpose becomes. These punishments were not only about sin, they were about control of the body, control of desire, control of thought. The law did not merely destroy transgressors, it molded citizens through terror. Every scream that echoed through Babylon's courtyards became a lesson, every execution a story retold to children as a warning. Justice, in this empire, was not blind. It was voyeuristic, ritualistic, and endlessly hungry. But Babylon had not yet revealed its darkest invention. Beyond the drownings, beyond the branding and mutilation, there existed punishments so profound that even the scribes hesitated to inscribe them. These were the rituals reserved for those who defied not only human law, but divine order itself. For them, the sentence was not simply pain, it was transformation. The body would become a temple of suffering, and the punishment would continue long after death. And that is where we must go next, into the heart of Babylon's ultimate horror, where justice became worship and cruelty became sacred law. There came a point in Babylon's long reign where punishment itself transcended the limits of justice and entered the realm of ritualized horror. What began as law etched in basalt and sanctioned by kings became a form of worship, a communion of cruelty disguised as divine duty. The empire that had once claimed to civilize humanity turned its mastery of law into a masterpiece of terror. In the final and most secret tier of Babylonian punishment, the human body ceased to be a mere subject of justice. It became the very altar upon which justice was enacted. These punishments were rarely recorded in tablets. They survived through fragments, half-erased cuneiform lines, whispers in later texts, echoes that scholars would call myths to avoid confronting their reality. Yet beneath the ruins of the ziggurats and the broken temples of Ishtar, the truth remains. Babylon's most sacred laws were written not in stone, but in flesh. Among the most feared crimes was the desecration of a temple, particularly one devoted to the goddess Ishtar, patroness of love, fertility, and war. To defile the temple's sanctity through forbidden intercourse, to touch what was reserved for the divine, was considered an act not of passion but of cosmic rebellion. Those found guilty of such blasphemy were condemned to what the priests called the ritual of reversal, a punishment designed to invert pleasure into agony, fertility into destruction, life into spectacle. The condemned would be led to the temple courtyard, surrounded by an audience of nobles, scribes, and guards. The high priest would recite hymns invoking Shamash and Ereshkigal, summoning the twin forces of light and death to witness what was to come. The offender, stripped bare, was symbolically unmade before the gods, his or her body treated as both offering and warning. For women accused of violating sacred vows, the punishment could take the form of enforced sexual humiliation, followed by mutilation or death. Bound to wooden frames shaped like the goddess's sigil, they were displayed before the temple steps, where the crowd would witness their degradation as proof of divine justice. Priests, their faces painted in the colors of divinity, presided with ritual detachment as if the act were liturgy, not punishment. Some accounts suggest that the condemned were forced to endure acts meant to cleanse them of desire, performed by those appointed as instruments of the gods. The boundaries between sacred ritual and torture dissolved completely. What had once been holy union was now desecration, masquerading as purification. When the ritual ended, the victims were often burned or buried beneath the temple floor, their remains believed to seal away impurity, their agony converted into cosmic balance. For male offenders, the horror took a different but equally calculated form. Those who had violated the sanctity of divine order, whether by incest, temple defilement, or assaulting women of high station, were subjected to mutilations of such precision that they resembled sacrifices rather than punishments. Castration was only the beginning. In cases deemed unforgivable, the condemned were impaled through the lower abdomen or genitals, the wooden stake passing slowly through the body until it emerged from the chest or neck. This act was not simply execution. It was performance, a grim theater of atonement played out under the open sky. The priests declared it a sacred offering, returning the sinner's life to the gods through the channel of his own sin. The victims did not die quickly. Their bodies hung for hours, twisting against the pole, their blood darkening the sand at the temple's entrance. The smell of iron and smoke mingled with incense, and the crowd chanted hymns meant to drown out the screams. In Babylon, pain was not hidden, it was consecrated. The ideology behind these punishments was as monstrous as it was meticulous. The priests taught that suffering purified the world, that every cry of pain was a debt paid to the gods for human corruption. They claimed that, without these punishments, the gods would withdraw their favor, and famine, disease, and invasion would follow. Thus, cruelty became a form of worship, and obedience a transaction paid in blood. The state, ever pragmatic, found in this theology the perfect tool of control. The king's scribes would inscribe decrees describing these punishments not as vengeance but as restoration, maintaining the illusion that horror was holiness. Justice became an act of devotion, and devotion became indistinguishable from sadism. But what makes Babylon's system so haunting is not its brutality alone. It is its logic. There was an intelligence behind the cruelty, a deliberate understanding of how terror could mold obedience. By transforming punishment into ritual, the state ensured that no act of rebellion could exist without religious consequence. Even those who doubted the gods could not escape the law, for to defy the priests was to defy the heavens themselves. In this way, Babylon engineered a form of psychological imprisonment far more enduring than any chain or prison cell. The citizens internalized their fear until it became faith. They worshipped the very system that destroyed them. And that, perhaps, was Babylon's most chilling invention. Not torture itself, but the sanctification of it. There are references, faint but undeniable, to ceremonies in which the condemned were forced to participate in their own punishment, to recite prayers as their bodies were destroyed, to thank the gods for purifying them. It is said that some priests believed the victim's final scream released divine energy, appeasing Ishtar's fury or satisfying Shamash's thirst for order. The notion of pain as sacred currency turned the entire city into a spiritual marketplace of suffering. Each death was an offering, each mutilation a tithe. Babylon did not merely punish, it consumed. And yet, amid this darkness, one cannot help but sense the paradox that defined the empire's soul. This was a civilization of architects, astronomers, and poets, a people who charted the stars and built gardens that hung in the air. Yet they also devised punishments that desecrated the human spirit in the name of divine perfection. How could such beauty and cruelty coexist? Perhaps because both sprang from the same desire to control the uncontrollable, to impose order on chaos, even if that order required blood. Babylon's genius was not merely in its cities or its laws, it was in its ability to make horror seem righteous. Every act of torture was a sermon, every corpse a monument to obedience. When historians later uncovered the surviving fragments of the Code of Hammurabi, they marveled at its complexity and moral vision. But the tablets do not show the faces of those who suffered beneath their words. They do not capture the trembling of the accused as they awaited sentence, or the sound of the crowd as justice was performed. They do not reveal that beneath every law written in stone, there were hundreds written in blood. The tablets stand today in museums, symbols of mankind's first step toward civilization, but perhaps they are also relics of its first great hypocrisy. In the end, Babylon's obsession with purity did not preserve it, it doomed it. The same belief that the gods demanded suffering made the empire blind to its own decay. As centuries passed, the rivers that once carried judgment began to carry silt and silence. The ziggurats crumbled, the temples fell, and the idols of the gods were buried in the sand. Yet the spirit of its justice, the belief that pain sanctifies, that shame redeems, outlived the city itself. When we look at Babylon today, we do not see an empire of laws. We see the reflection of a truth humanity has never escaped, that every civilization believes its cruelty is divine. And so the question lingers like incense in the ruins. Did Babylon's gods demand these horrors, or did men invent them to feel like gods themselves? Whatever the answer, the empire's legacy is unmistakable. It was here, amid the smoke and stone, that the blueprint for sacred cruelty was born. And though the rivers have long since dried, their waters still whisper the same lesson, that the line between justice and monstrosity is far thinner than we dare to believe. The ruins of Babylon now lie silent beneath the desert sun, their broken bricks scattered like the bones of a forgotten god. The wind that moves through its empty courtyards no longer carries the sound of drums or chains, only the low sigh of time erasing its own sins. And yet, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of judgment still lingering in the dust. The same city that once called itself the cradle of civilization also became the birthplace of a darker inheritance. The idea that morality can be enforced through terror, that divinity requires pain, that purity demands sacrifice. The ziggurats that once reached toward the heavens now crumble into the earth, but the spirit of Babylon, the sanctified cruelty hidden beneath the guise of justice, has survived far beyond its fall. For the laws that once drowned the guilty in the Euphrates have found new rivers in the modern world, flowing quietly through courts, prisons, and societies that still believe punishment is purification. It is easy to dismiss the Babylonians as primitive, their rituals as superstition, their laws as barbaric relics of a lost age. But to do so is to ignore how much of their reasoning remains alive within us. The spectacle of shame has not vanished, it has evolved. The arenas have turned digital, and the torches have become screens, but the hunger to witness suffering, to measure morality through pain, endures. Babylon's courtyards were filled with people who believed they were defending purity as they watched their neighbors drown or burn. Today, we scroll through the same cruelty, only the language has changed. The moral theater is endless, judgment disguised as virtue, humiliation as entertainment, condemnation as justice. The impulse is the same, only the rituals have shifted. Babylon never truly died, it merely learned to hide behind civility. What makes its legacy haunting is not its brutality, but its brilliance, the cold intelligence with which it used belief as a weapon. By convincing people that their cruelty was sacred, Babylon built an empire that needed no rebellion to sustain fear. The citizens policed themselves, the faithful enforced their own suffering. And in that mechanism lies the pattern that every civilization since has repeated in its own way. The names of the gods have changed, the punishments modernized, the rituals sterilized, but the core idea remains untouched, that control must be sanctified to endure. Babylon's priests are gone, but their philosophy lingers in every law written to preserve order at the expense of mercy, in every system that values purity over compassion, obedience over humanity. The city that once stood as the world's greatest symbol of enlightenment left behind not only its architecture, but its paradox, a reminder that progress and cruelty often share the same foundations. The more a society believes itself civilized, the more creative its methods of punishment become. Babylon proved that empires do not fall when their walls crumble, they fall when their hearts begin to resemble the gods they fear. Its legacy is not confined to the desert. It is carved into the moral codes of every nation that has ever justified pain in the name of justice. So when we look upon Babylon's ruins, we are not merely looking at the past. We are looking into a mirror, and the reflection staring back is uncomfortably familiar. The ghosts of its laws live on in our collective conscience, whispering the same question that haunted the priests who once ruled by fear. Is punishment the price of order, or the proof that we have never truly escaped the darkness we claim to condemn? And that, perhaps, is the truest punishment of all, that Babylon still breathes through us. Its laws have turned to dust, but its lessons have not. Every empire builds its temples on suffering. Babylon merely perfected the illusion that its cruelty was divine. If you've made it this far into the shadow of history, you've seen what most dare not face. The past does not only live in ruins, it lives in us. Which of these ancient horrors haunts you most? Tell me below. And if you wish to keep descending into the forgotten depths of human civilization, into the empires where sin and sanctity were one and the same, make sure to subscribe, because next time we'll open another tomb history tried to seal shut.